They paid just $12,000 for a fire-gutted mansion everyone called cursed. But what Harold and Betty Simmons found sealed beneath the grand staircase would shatter everything they thought they knew about luck, loss, and second chances. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog hung low over the Cumberland Plateau, curling through the valleys like smoke from an old chimney. Harold Simmons stood at the window of their cramped two-bedroom apartment, watching the mist swallow the parking lot below. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. He was thinking about the letter on the kitchen table, the one from the landlord, the one that said their rent was going up another $150 a month starting January 1st. 78 years old and still worried about making rent. Some things never changed. Behind him, Betty shuffled into the kitchen, her slippers whispering against the worn linoleum. She was 76 now, her hair silver and thin, her hands marked with age spots that hadn't been there a decade ago. But her eyes, those soft brown eyes that had captured his heart at a church picnic 53 years ago, still held the same quiet warmth. "You're brooding again," she said, reaching past him to start a fresh pot of coffee. "I can always tell. You get that look like you're solving a puzzle nobody gave you." Harold turned from the window and managed a small smile. "Just thinking." "About the letter?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Betty sighed and pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, the same chipped ceramic mugs they'd been using since 1982. "We'll figure it out, Harold. We always do." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Not anymore. Not with his Social Security barely covering the basics and her small pension from 31 years of working in the elementary school cafeteria stretched thinner than tissue paper. The medical bills alone from his heart procedure last spring had wiped out what little savings they'd managed to hold on to. Harold lowered himself into the kitchen chair, his knees protesting the way they always did now. On the table sat the newspaper, folded open to the classifieds. He'd been looking at job listings, part-time things, anything a man his age might still be able to do. But who hired 78-year-olds? Who wanted hands that shook when they got too tired, eyes that needed reading glasses for everything, a back that seized up after an hour of standing? "I spoke to Margaret yesterday," Betty said carefully, pouring the fresh coffee. Harold's jaw tightened. Margaret was their daughter, their only living child after they'd lost their son William to a car accident in 2003. Margaret lived in California now, had a good job in marketing, a nice house, a husband who worked in finance. She'd offered them money more than once over the years. Harold had refused every time. "And what did Margaret have to say?" Betty set his mug in front of him. "She's worried about us. She wants to help." "We don't need her money." "Harold." "I said no, Betty." His voice was sharper than he intended. He softened immediately, reaching for her hand. "I'm sorry. I worked 41 years at that factory. 41 years of honest labor. I didn't do that so I could take handouts from my own daughter at the end of my life." Betty squeezed his fingers. "It wouldn't be a handout. It would be family helping family. It would feel like failure." She didn't argue. She understood, even if she didn't agree. That was one of the things he loved most about her. After 53 years of marriage, she knew when to push and when to simply be present. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, listening to the radiator clank and hiss. The apartment was too small, too old, too cold in the winters, and too hot in the summers. The carpet was stained in places they couldn't reach anymore. The bathroom faucet dripped no matter how many times Harold tried to fix it. The walls were thin enough to hear their neighbors arguing about money, about kids, about all the things people argue about when life gets too heavy. This wasn't how Harold had pictured his final years. He'd imagined a little house somewhere, nothing fancy, Just something with a yard where Betty could plant her flowers. A porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the fireflies come out. A place that belonged to them, that no landlord could take away, that would still be standing when they were gone. But dreams like that cost money they didn't have. "I had a dream last night," Betty said suddenly, her voice soft and distant. Harold looked up. "What kind of dream?" "We were standing in front of a big old house, white columns, a sweeping driveway, gardens everywhere, and you turned to me and said, 'This is ours now, Betty. This is finally ours.'" Harold chuckled despite himself. "Sounds like a nice dream." "It felt real," she said quietly. "It felt like a promise." He reached across the table and touched her cheek, weathered and warm. "I wish I could give you that, sweetheart. I wish I could give you everything you deserve." Betty smiled, that same smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "You already have, Harold. You've given me 53 years of love. That's more than most people ever get." But later that morning, as Betty took her walk around the block, and Harold sat alone with the newspaper, he found himself staring at a small notice buried in the back pages. "County tax auction," it read. "Properties available for back taxes owed." And there, listed among the foreclosed trailers and abandoned lots, was something that made him stop breathing. Pemberton Estate, 27,000 square feet, 43 acres, fire damaged, 1987, current bid $12,000. Harold read it 3 times. Then he read it again. The Pemberton Estate. Everyone in Hawkins County knew that name. The mansion had been built in 1926 by a railroad tycoon, then purchased in 1961 by Marcus Pemberton, an eccentric billionaire who made his fortune in early computer technology before anyone even knew what computers would become. Pemberton had been a recluse, a mystery, a man who rarely left his property and never entertained guests. And in 1987, the mansion had burned. The fire had been devastating. The entire east wing collapsed. The roof caved in over the grand ballroom. Marcus Pemberton died in the blaze, along with his daughter, a young woman named Eleanor, who had been visiting from New York. The official cause was ruled as an electrical fault, though rumors had circulated for decades that something darker had happened that night. Since then, the property had sat untouched. No one wanted it. Some said it was haunted by the ghosts of Marcus and Eleanor. Others said the land itself was cursed, that anyone who tried to claim it would suffer misfortune. A developer had purchased it in 1994 and died of a heart attack 3 weeks later. Another buyer in 2008 lost everything in the financial crash before he could even begin renovations. The county had seized it again and again for unpaid taxes, and again it sat empty. $12,000. Harold stared at the number. That was almost exactly what they had left in their savings account. It was everything, their entire safety net. The money they'd set aside for emergencies, for medical bills, for the inevitable costs of getting older. It was insane to even consider it. And yet, he thought about Betty's dream, the white columns, the sweeping driveway, the gardens. He thought about the rent increase coming in January. He thought about spending whatever years they had left in this cramped apartment, watching their money dwindle to nothing, becoming a burden on their daughter whether they wanted to or not. And he thought about one simple truth. At 78 years old, how many chances did a man have left to take? When Betty came home from her walk, cheeks flushed from the cold, Harold was still sitting at the kitchen table. But the newspaper was gone, replaced by a notepad covered in his careful handwriting. "What's all this?" she asked, hanging up her coat. Harold took a deep breath. "Betty, I want to show you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say I've lost my mind." She sat down across from him, her expression shifting from curious to concerned. "You're scaring me, Harold." "I know. I'm scaring myself." He slid the newspaper clipping across the table. but I think this might be our last chance at something real." Betty picked up the clipping and read it slowly. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and when she looked up at him, there was something in her face he hadn't seen in years. Hope. "The Pemberton estate?" she whispered. "Harold, that place is a ruin. Everyone says it's cursed." "Everyone says a lot of things, doesn't make them true." "But $12,000, that's everything we have." "I know. If we lose it, then we're no worse off than we'll be in 5 years anyway, when the savings run out and we can't afford even this apartment." Harold leaned forward, taking both her hands in his. "Betty, I've spent my whole life playing it safe, working the same job for 41 years because it was steady, renting instead of buying because we couldn't afford the risk, saying no to everything that scared me because I was afraid of what we might lose." He paused, his voice catching. "But look where SAFE got us. We're 78 and 76 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment that smells like mildew, counting pennies to afford our medications. I don't want to die like this, Betty. I don't want to spend my last years just surviving." Betty's eyes glistened. She looked down at the clipping again, at the words "fire damaged" and "as-is condition" and "no warranty expressed or implied." "It would be madness," she said quietly. "Probably. The whole town would think we'd lost our minds." "Probably. We could lose everything." "Yes." She was silent for a long moment. Harold watched her face, watched the calculations happening behind her eyes. 53 years of marriage, and he still couldn't always read her. That was part of what made her wonderful. Finally, she looked up at him. "When is the auction?" "Saturday, 3 days from now." "Yes." She squeezed his hands, her grip stronger than he expected. "Then we'd better go see it first. If we're going to risk everything we have, I want to know what we're risking it on." The drive out to the Pemberton estate took 45 minutes, winding through back roads that Harold hadn't traveled in decades. The landscape changed as they went, shifting from small farms and modest houses to dense forest and overgrown fields. The further they drove, the more it felt like they were leaving the modern world behind. The entrance to the property was marked by 2 massive stone pillars, one of which had partially collapsed and was covered in ivy. A rusted iron gate hung open at an angle, its hinges long since frozen with age. Beyond it, a gravel driveway disappeared into a tunnel of oak trees, their bare branches reaching toward each other like skeletal fingers. Harold stopped the car and looked at Betty. "Last chance to turn back." She shook her head. "Drive." They crept down the driveway at barely 10 miles per hour, the old sedan suspension groaning over potholes and exposed roots. The trees pressed close on either side, blocking out most of the pale winter sunlight. It felt like entering another world, a world that time had forgotten. And then the trees parted, and they saw it. The Pemberton mansion rose from the overgrown grounds like a wounded giant. Even in its ruined state, even with the collapsed east wing and the blackened walls and the roof that had caved in over what must have been the grand ballroom, it was magnificent. White columns still stood at the entrance, scorched but proud. A sweeping stone staircase led up to massive oak doors that hung crooked on their hinges. What remained of the architecture spoke of a time when craftsmen took decades to complete a single building, when every detail mattered, when beauty was built to last. Betty gasped beside him. "Oh, Harold!" He couldn't speak. He just stared. They sat in the car for several minutes, neither of them moving. Finally, Harold opened his door and stepped out into the cold air. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing but the distant whisper of bare branches swaying. Betty joined him, her hand finding his automatically. Together, they walked toward the entrance. Up close, the damage was more severe than it had appeared from the driveway. The fire had devoured entire sections of the building, leaving behind charred beams and collapsed floors. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets. The smell of old smoke still lingered after nearly 40 years, mixed with the mustier odors of rot and decay. But as they climbed the stone steps and peered through the ruined doorway, Harold noticed something else. The main structure, the central core of the mansion, was still standing. The walls were solid, the foundation showed no cracks, and most remarkably, the grand marble staircase that swept up from the entrance hall was almost completely untouched. "Look at that," he murmured, pointing. Betty followed his gaze. The staircase rose in an elegant curve, its white marble steps still gleaming faintly beneath a layer of dust and debris. While everything around it had burned, the stairs themselves seemed almost pristine. "How is that possible?" Betty whispered. "Everything else is destroyed, but those stairs—" Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But marble doesn't burn like wood. Maybe it was just luck." They stepped carefully through the doorway, testing each floorboard before putting their weight on it. The entrance hall had once been magnificent, that much was clear. The ceiling had partially collapsed, but the portions that remained showed hints of ornate molding and what might have been a painted fresco. A massive chandelier lay shattered on the floor, its crystal pendants scattered like frozen tears. But Harold's eyes kept returning to the staircase. He approached it slowly, running his hand along the marble railing. It was cold and smooth beneath his fingers, surprisingly clean compared to everything else. He climbed the first few steps, feeling their solidity, their permanence. "Careful," Betty called from below. "It's solid," he said. "More solid than anything else in this place." He climbed higher, testing each step. The marble was cool and unyielding, not cracked, not warped, not damaged in any visible way. When he reached the landing where the staircase split in two directions, he paused and looked back down at Betty. "This is the strongest part of the whole building," he said. "Whoever built this staircase, they built it to last forever." Betty climbed up to join him, her breath coming a little harder than it should. When she reached the landing, she stood beside him and looked out over the ruined entrance hall below. "I can see it," she said softly. "See what?" "What it used to be, what it could be again." She turned to face him, her eyes bright despite the cold. "Harold, I know this is crazy. I know everyone will say we've lost our minds, but I feel something here. I can't explain it. It's like this place has been waiting for someone." Harold looked at the staircase, at the walls, at the patches of sky visible through the damaged roof. He thought about his factory job, about 41 years of doing the same thing every day because it was safe. He thought about the apartment they'd returned to tonight, with its dripping faucet and its thin walls and its growing rent. And he thought about Betty's dream, the white columns, the sweeping driveway. "This is ours now, Betty. This is finally ours." "Then let's not make it wait any longer," he said. The auction was held in the Hawkins County Courthouse, a brick building that had stood since 1892. Harold and Betty arrived early, dressed in their best clothes, which wasn't saying much. Harold wore the suit he'd bought for William's funeral 15 years ago. Betty wore a floral dress that had been out of style for at least a decade. They looked like what they were, a poor elderly couple with no business bidding on mansions. The auction room was nearly empty. A few real estate speculators sat in the back, flipping through folders and checking their phones. A young couple near the front whispered nervously to each other, and in the corner, a man in an expensive suit studied the lot listings with cold, calculating eyes. Harold and Betty took seats in the middle row and waited. The auctioneer was a heavy-set woman with a no-nonsense voice and a gavel that she wielded like a weapon. She worked through the foreclosed properties quickly, a mobile home that sold for $800, a vacant lot that went for $2,000, a small cabin in the woods that attracted a brief bidding war before settling at $9,500. Then she cleared her throat and looked down at her notes. "Lot number 17, she announced. "The Pemberton Estate, 27,000 square feet, 43 acres, fire damaged in 1987, sold as is, No warranty expressed or implied. County requires minimum bid of $10,000. She looked out at the room. Do I have 10,000? Harold raised his hand. The auctioneer nodded. 10,000 to the gentleman in the grey suit. Do I have 11? Silence. Harold's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel Betty's hand gripping his arm, her fingers trembling. The man in the expensive suit shifted in his seat but didn't raise his hand. The young couple glanced at each other and shook their heads. 11,000? The auctioneer repeated. Anyone? Nothing. Going once at 10,000? Harold held his breath. Going twice? Still nothing. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed off the courthouse walls. Sold to the gentleman in grey for $10,000. Betty let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Harold sat frozen in his seat, unable to believe what had just happened. They'd budgeted $12,000. They'd prepared for a bidding war, and instead they'd won the Pemberton estate for $10,000. Congratulations, the auctioneer said flatly. See the clerk for paperwork. As they stood to leave, Harold noticed the man in the expensive suit watching them. There was something in his expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of cold assessment, like he was taking their measure, like he was filing them away for future reference. Harold met his gaze and held it until the man looked away. The paperwork took 3 hours. Signatures, notarizations, disclosures about the property's condition, warnings about liability, forms and more forms. By the time they walked out of the courthouse, the winter sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Betty clutched the deed in both hands like it was made of gold. We own a mansion, she whispered. Harold laughed, the sound surprising even him. We own a ruin, sweetheart. We own potential, she corrected. We own possibility. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. We own a future. They drove back to the estate as the last light faded from the sky. This time, when they pulled through the rusted gates and down the overgrown driveway, everything felt different. The skeletal trees weren't threatening. They were theirs. The crumbling pillars weren't ruins. They were projects waiting to be tackled. The mansion itself, rising dark and silent against the evening sky, wasn't a haunted wreck. It was home. They didn't stay long that night. They were too old and too tired, and the building had no electricity or running water. But before they left, they walked together up the front steps and through the broken doorway. Harold pulled out a flashlight and swept its beam across the entrance hall. Shadows leaped and danced on the walls. Somewhere in the darkness, something small scurried away from the light. Tomorrow, Betty said, we start. Tomorrow, Harold agreed. But as they turned to leave, his flashlight beam caught something on the grand staircase, something he hadn't noticed during their first visit. He froze. Harold? Betty asked. What is it? He walked slowly toward the stairs, his flashlight trained on the third step from the bottom. In the daylight, he'd missed it entirely. But now, in the harsh beam of the flashlight, he could see it clearly. A seam, a thin, almost invisible line running along the edge of the marble step. Not a crack from age or damage. Something too straight, too deliberate. Something that shouldn't be there. Harold knelt down, his knees protesting, and ran his fingers along the seam. The marble was cold and smooth, but at the edge he felt something else. A tiny gap, a space where the stone didn't quite meet flush with the riser. Betty, he said quietly, come look at this. She joined him, peering down at where his fingers traced the mysterious line. What is it? I don't know. He pressed gently on the marble, feeling for movement. Nothing. He pressed harder, still nothing. But when he ran his finger along the seam itself, pushing slightly inward, he felt something give. A soft click echoed through the empty hall, and the marble step shifted. Harold jerked his hand back. Betty grabbed his arm. They both stared at the staircase, hearts pounding, as a thin line of darkness appeared along the seam. The step had moved, just slightly, just an inch, but it had moved. "Harold," Betty breathed, "what did you do?" "I don't know," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think there's something under these stairs." They looked at each other in the flashlight's glow. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the broken windows. The mansion creaked and groaned around them, settling into the cold night. Whatever was hidden beneath that marble step had been waiting for nearly 40 years, and Harold Simmons had just found it. Harold didn't sleep that night. Neither did Betty. They drove back to their apartment in silence, both of them replaying the moment over and over in their minds. The click, the shift, the thin line of darkness appearing in the marble. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, it was nearly 9 o'clock. Betty heated up leftover soup while Harold sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "We should go back tomorrow," Betty said, setting a bowl in front of him. "First thing in the morning." Harold nodded slowly. "We need tools, a pry bar, flashlights, maybe a rope." "A rope? We don't know how deep it goes. We don't know what's down there." Betty sat across from him, her soup untouched. "Harold, what if it's just old plumbing or a root cellar? Mansions like that, they had all kinds of hidden spaces for storage." "Maybe," he admitted. "But that click, Betty, that was mechanical, that was designed. Someone built that staircase to hide something." They ate in silence, neither of them tasting the food. When they finally went to bed, Harold lay awake for hours, listening to Betty's breathing slow into sleep. His mind raced through possibilities. Old wine bottles, forgotten furniture, construction materials left behind by builders who never finished the job. But something deeper, something he couldn't explain, told him it was more than that. The next morning, they were at the hardware store when it opened at 7. Harold bought 2 heavy-duty flashlights, a pry bar, a coil of rope, work gloves, and dust masks. The teenager at the register looked at them curiously, but didn't ask questions. "Starting a project?" he said as he rang them up. "You could say that," Harold replied. They arrived at the Pemberton estate just after 8. The morning was cold and grey, frost still clinging to the overgrown lawn. Harold parked as close to the entrance as he could get and helped Betty out of the car. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, studying her face. "We could wait. Hire someone to check it out first." Betty shook her head firmly. "We've waited our whole lives, Harold. We're not waiting any more." Together, they climbed the stone steps and entered the ruined mansion. Daylight filtered through the holes in the roof, illuminating the entrance hall in pale, dusty beams. The grand staircase rose before them, its marble steps gleaming faintly in the light. Harold approached the 3rd step, the one that had moved last night. In the daylight, the seam was almost invisible. If he hadn't known exactly where to look, he never would have found it. He knelt down, his knees complaining louder than yesterday, and ran his fingers along the edge. There. The tiny gap, the slight give. "Same spot," he said. "Help me with this." Betty knelt beside him, and together they pressed along the seam until they heard that same soft click. The marble step shifted again, this time moving more freely. Harold wedged the pry bar into the gap and pushed. The step lifted. Beneath it was darkness. Harold shined his flashlight into the opening, his heart hammering against his ribs. The beam revealed a narrow passage, maybe 3 feet wide, leading down at a steep angle. Stone steps, different from the marble above, descended into the earth. "My God," Betty whispered. Harold looked at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was no fear in her expression, only wonder. "Stay here," he said. "Let me go first and make sure it's safe." "Absolutely not." Betty's voice was firm. We do this together, or not at all. He wanted to argue. He wanted to protect her. But he'd learned long ago that Betty Simmons was not a woman who could be told what to do. So instead, he took her hand and helped her to her feet. Together then. They descended slowly, Harold in front with the flashlight, Betty close behind with her hand on his shoulder. The passage was narrow, and the air grew colder with each step. The walls were rough-hewn stone, old and solid, the kind of construction that predated the mansion itself. "This wasn't built in 1926, Harold muttered. "This is older, much older." "What do you mean?" "I mean someone dug this out before the mansion was even here. Maybe an old mine shaft, maybe a natural cave that someone expanded." He ran his hand along the wall. "The Pemberton family didn't build this. They found it and built their staircase over it." They continued down for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 60 or 70 steps. Harold counted them as they went, a habit from his factory days when he'd count parts to stay focused during long shifts. At step number 63, the passage leveled out into a small landing, and there, set into the stone wall, was a door. Not a modern door. Something older, heavier. Oak planks reinforced with iron bands, like something from a medieval castle. A massive padlock hung from a hasp that had been bolted directly into the rock. Harold examined the lock. It was rusted but intact, clearly original to whatever this place was. No one had been through this door in decades. "We can't break that," Betty said quietly. Harold nodded, frustration building in his chest. To come this far and be stopped by a lock. But then he noticed something else. Beside the door, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small alcove carved into the stone, and inside the alcove was a metal box, green with oxidation, about the size of a shoebox. He reached in and pulled it out. The lid was stiff, but not locked. Inside, resting on a bed of rotted velvet, was a key. Not just any key. A heavy iron key, ornate and old, with a bow shaped like a lion's head. "Betty," Harold breathed, "I think this is it." His hands trembled as he lifted the key and approached the padlock. The key slid in with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting for this moment. He turned it. The mechanism groaned. Rust flaked away. And then, with a heavy clunk that echoed through the passage, the padlock fell open. Harold removed it and set it aside. He looked at Betty one more time. She nodded. He pushed open the door. The flashlight beam swept across a space so large, so unexpected, that Harold's mind couldn't process it at first. He stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a vault. Not a natural cave, not an old storage room, but a purpose-built vault carved into the bedrock beneath the mansion. The ceiling arched overhead, supported by stone columns that looked almost Roman in design. The floor was smooth concrete, surprisingly clean compared to everything above. And along the walls, stretching into the darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight, were rows of metal shelving. "Harold," Betty said behind him, "what is this place?" He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The air was cool and dry, controlled somehow, preserved. As he moved deeper, his flashlight revealed more details. Filing cabinets, wooden crates stacked neatly against the far wall, and on the metal shelves, rows upon rows of identical metal containers, each one sealed and labeled with numbers and dates. "It's a vault," he said, his voice sounding strange in the enclosed space. "Someone built an entire vault under this mansion." Betty joined him, her own flashlight sweeping across the opposite wall. "Look at this!" She was pointing at something mounted on the wall, a panel of switches and gauges, old but clearly sophisticated. Harold approached and examined it closely. "Climate control," he said, recognizing some of the components. "Dehumidifiers, temperature regulation. Whoever built this wanted to preserve whatever they stored here." "But for how long, and why?" Harold shook his head. He had no answers, only more questions. They moved deeper into the vault, past the filing cabinets, past the crates, to the rows of metal containers on the shelves. Harold selected one at random and lifted it down. It was heavy, much heavier than its size suggested. "Help me with this," he said. Together, they set the container on the floor. It was sealed with a simple latch, no lock, just a metal clasp that had corroded slightly with age. Harold worked it open with his gloved fingers until the lid came free. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed but not degraded, were bundles. Bundles of money, $100 bills, stacked and bound with paper bands, more than Harold could count at a glance. He lifted one bundle with trembling hands. The bills were old, the design from an earlier era, but they were real. They were unmistakably real. "Oh my God," Betty whispered. "Harold, oh my God." He couldn't speak. He just stared at the money in his hands, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. Betty grabbed another container from the shelf, smaller this time. She opened it and gasped. Gold. Not coins, not jewelry, but bars. Small gold bars, each one stamped with a weight and a serial number. They gleamed in the flashlight beam like captured sunlight. Harold set down the bundle of cash and moved to another shelf. More containers. He opened one after another, each revelation more staggering than the last. Bearer bonds, hundreds of them, issued by corporations and governments that might not even exist anymore. Stock certificates from companies Harold recognized, General Electric, AT&T, IBM, dated from the 1950s and 60s. Bundles of currency from different countries, British pounds, Swiss francs, German marks from before the euro. And in the wooden crates against the far wall, wrapped in velvet and packed with extraordinary care, were gems. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, stones of every color, some as large as Betty's thumbnail, all of them catching the flashlight beam and throwing rainbows across the stone walls. Harold sank to his knees in the middle of the vault. His legs simply gave out beneath him. Betty knelt beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "How much?" she whispered. "Harold, how much is here?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Millions. Maybe tens of millions." He paused, looking around at the endless shelves. Maybe more. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the cold vault, surrounded by a fortune beyond anything either of them had ever imagined. The silence was absolute, broken only by their breathing and the soft hum of whatever ancient machinery kept the climate controlled. Finally, Betty spoke. "We need to count it." "That could take days. Then we'd better start. What happens next will turn this discovery into a battle between greed and grace, between the couple's quiet integrity and forces determined to take everything from them. Stay tuned to see what unfolds. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They worked through that entire day and into the night. They didn't eat, they didn't rest. They simply moved through the vault, container by container, crate by crate, documenting everything they found. Harold had brought a notebook, originally intended for jotting down repair estimates for the mansion. Instead, it became a ledger of impossibilities. Cash, United States currency, 347 bundles of $10,000 each. Total, $3,470,000. Gold bars, 112 bars, approximately 1 kilogram each at current gold prices, worth approximately $6,700,000. Bearer bonds, face value undetermined but potentially worth tens of millions depending on which ones could still be redeemed. Stock certificates, thousands of shares in blue-chip companies, many of them predating stock splits that would have multiplied their value many times over. Gems, uncounted, but filling 7 wooden crates. Even a conservative estimate suggested millions more, and they hadn't even opened everything. There were filing cabinets they hadn't touched, containers on high shelves they couldn't reach, and an entire section of the vault behind a second door they hadn't yet explored. By midnight, Betty's hand was cramping from writing. Harold's knees had swollen from kneeling on the cold concrete. They sat together on a wooden crate, flashlights propped to illuminate the space around them, and tried to comprehend what they'd found. 260 million, Betty said quietly, reading from the notebook. That's our rough estimate. $260 million. Harold laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria. Yesterday we were worried about making rent. Yesterday we were different people. He looked at her in the dim light. Her face was streaked with dust, her hair escaping from its pins, her clothes rumpled from crawling around the vault. She had never looked more beautiful to him. "What do we do now?" he asked. Betty was quiet for a long moment. Then she pointed her flashlight at the far corner of the vault, at something they'd passed earlier but hadn't examined closely. "We start there." It was a desk. Not a grand executive desk, but a simple wooden writing desk, the kind a man might keep in his private study. It was positioned against the wall near the climate control panel, and on its surface, preserved under a sheet of protective plastic, were documents. Harold carefully lifted the plastic and examined what lay beneath. Letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but otherwise intact. He opened the journal to the first page and began to read aloud. "My name is Marcus James Pemberton. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and the fire I have long feared has finally come. I have written this account so that whoever finds my vault will understand what is here and why I chose to hide it." Betty leaned closer, her flashlight illuminating the cramped handwriting. Harold continued. "I was born in 1908 in a small town in Ohio. My father was a banker who lost everything in the crash of 1929. I watched him go from a respected man to a broken one in a matter of weeks. He took his own life 6 months later, unable to face the shame of poverty." Harold paused, his throat tightening. "That day I made myself a promise. I would never trust banks. I would never trust institutions. I would never put my faith in systems that could fail overnight and destroy everything a man had worked for." The journal continued, chronicling Marcus Pemberton's rise from poverty to extraordinary wealth. He'd started with nothing, working as a laborer, then as a mechanic, then as an engineer at a small electronics company. By 1952, he'd patented a crucial component in early computer technology. By 1960, he was a millionaire. By 1970, 100 times that. But he never forgot his father's lesson. "I converted my wealth slowly, carefully, over decades," the journal read. "Cash, gold, bonds, assets that could not be erased by a stock market crash or a bank failure. I built this vault in 1963, beneath the mansion I purchased 2 years earlier. I told no one of its existence, not my wife, who died in 1971, not my daughter Eleanor, who I loved more than life itself, but could not bring myself to burden with this secret." Harold turned the page. "I always intended to use this fortune for good. I had plans, grand plans, to build hospitals, to fund scholarships, to establish foundations that would help people like my father, people destroyed by forces beyond their control. But I was afraid. I had spent so many years hiding, so many years trusting no one, that I could not find the courage to step into the light." The handwriting grew shakier as the entries continued. "And now I fear it is too late. There are men who suspect what I have, men who have watched me for years, waiting for an opportunity. I have seen them in town, asking questions. I have found evidence that someone has been on my property at night, searching. I believe they will come for me soon, and when they do, I believe they will use fire." Betty gasped softly. "The mansion can burn. Let it burn. But the vault will survive. The staircase will protect it, as it was designed to do. And someday, someone will find this journal and understand." Harold turned to the final entry. It was dated August 12, 1987, 3 days before the fire. "To whoever reads these words, this fortune is now yours. I ask only one thing. Do what I could not. Use it to help people. Use it to build something that matters. Do not let it sit in darkness any longer. I have lived as a coward. Perhaps you will live as something better. Marcus James Pemberton. Harold closed the journal. The silence in the vault was absolute. Betty wiped tears from her cheeks. He was going to give it all away. But he never got the chance. The fire. It wasn't an accident. Harold shook his head. He knew they were coming. He knew, and he couldn't stop them. They sat together at the old wooden desk, the journal between them, the weight of decades pressing down from above. Marcus Pemberton had died nearly 40 years ago, murdered for a fortune his killers never found. And now that fortune, along with his unfulfilled dreams, belonged to Harold and Betty Simmons. We could walk away, Harold said quietly. Take what we need and disappear. No one knows about this. No one has to know. Betty was silent for a long moment. Then she picked up the journal and held it against her chest. He trusted us, she said. Whoever found this, he trusted them to be better than he was. She looked at Harold with those soft brown eyes that had captured his heart 53 years ago. And I think we can be. Harold took her hand. You want to honor his wishes. I want to finish what he started. She paused. But first, we need to understand what really happened. Who killed him? Why they never found the vault? And whether those people are still out there. Harold nodded slowly. She was right. $260 million didn't stay hidden by accident. Someone had been protecting this secret for almost 4 decades. Someone who might still be watching. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we start digging into the past. They sealed the vault as best they could, replacing the padlock with a new one Harold had bought at the hardware store. They swept away their footprints on the dusty stairs and repositioned the marble step so that the seam was nearly invisible again. By the time they climbed back up to the entrance hall, the first grey light of dawn was creeping through the broken windows. They had been in the vault for nearly 20 hours. Betty leaned against Harold as they walked to the car, exhausted in a way neither of them had felt in years. We're not the same people who drove here yesterday, she said. No, Harold agreed. We're not. He helped her into the passenger seat, then walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he paused and looked back at the mansion. In the pale morning light, it looked different somehow. Less ruined. Less forgotten. It looked like a promise waiting to be kept. The next few days were a blur of research and revelation. They couldn't risk using the computers at the public library. Too many questions, too many prying eyes, so Betty drove to a Walmart 2 towns over and paid cash for a cheap laptop and a prepaid internet card. They set up in their apartment, curtains drawn, and began searching for the truth about Marcus Pemberton. The official story was simple enough. Reclusive billionaire dies in tragic house fire along with his daughter. Cause, electrical fault. Case closed. But when Harold dug deeper, cracks began to appear. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously. The fire marshal's report noted this anomaly but attributed it to accelerated spread due to aging wiring. No investigation was conducted. Marcus Pemberton had no living relatives, so his estate went to the state of Tennessee. The property sat in probate for years before being sold at auction to a developer in 1994. That developer, a man named Richard Crane, died of a heart attack 3 weeks after purchasing the property. His widow sold it back to the county for a fraction of what he'd paid. The pattern repeated twice more. Different buyers, different misfortunes. Each time, the property reverted to county ownership. Someone didn't want anyone living there, Betty said, studying the timeline they'd created on a yellow legal pad. Or looking too closely, Harold added. But the most disturbing discovery came when they researched the fire marshal who'd signed off on the original investigation. His name was Thomas Whitfield, and he'd retired in 1989, just 2 years after the Pemberton fire. He'd retired to a mansion in Florida, a mansion that a small-town fire marshal could never have afforded on his salary. Harold and Betty looked at each other across the kitchen table. "He was paid off," Betty said, "and whoever paid him is probably still out there, still powerful, still watching." Betty set down her coffee cup. "Then we need to be careful. We need to think this through before we do anything." "Agreed." Harold rubbed his eyes. "But we also need help. This is bigger than us. We need someone we can trust." Betty was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Harold hadn't expected. "We need to call Margaret." Harold stiffened. Their daughter, the one he'd refused to take money from, the one who lived 3,000 miles away in another world. "Betty, she's a lawyer, Harold. She knows people, and she's family." Betty reached across the table and took his hands. "You said you didn't want to take her charity. Fine, but this isn't charity. This is asking our daughter to help us do something important, something bigger than pride." Harold wanted to argue, but looking into Betty's eyes, he knew she was right. This was too big for two elderly people in a cramped apartment with a prepaid laptop. They needed help. He sighed heavily. "Fine, call her." Betty dialed the number before he could change his mind. Margaret answered on the third ring. "Mom, is everything okay? It's 6 in the morning here." "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry, but we need to talk." Betty took a deep breath. "Something has happened. Something you're not going to believe." The conversation lasted 3 hours. Margaret interrupted constantly at first, asking questions, demanding clarification, insisting that her parents had been scammed or were confused or were experiencing some kind of cognitive decline. But slowly, as Betty walked her through everything, the auction, the staircase, the vault, the journal, Margaret's tone changed. By the end, she was crying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "We only found it 2 days ago," Betty said, "and we wanted to understand what we were dealing with before we involved anyone else." $260 million. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, that's insane." "We know." "And you think the fire was arson, that someone murdered this Pemberton man for his money?" "We think so, yes. And we think whoever did it has been keeping people away from that property ever since." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice Harold had never heard from his daughter before, a voice of steel and determination, she said, "I'm coming home. Don't do anything. Don't tell anyone. Don't go back to that mansion until I get there." "Margaret." "I mean it, Mum. This is serious. This could be dangerous, and you're going to need protection." She paused, both legal and otherwise. Margaret arrived 2 days later, stepping off a plane at the Knoxville airport with a rolling suitcase and a briefcase full of legal documents. Harold barely recognized her. The little girl who used to help him change oil in the driveway had become a formidable woman in her 50s, grey streaking her dark hair, reading glasses perched on her nose. She hugged them both longer than she had in years. "I've made some calls," she said as they drove back to the apartment. "I have a colleague who specializes in estate law, another who handles historic property claims, and a private investigator who owes me a favor." "A private investigator?" Harold asked. "If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, then we need to know who we're dealing with before they know about us." Margaret pulled a folder from her briefcase. "I've already started researching. The fire marshal, Thomas Whitfield, he died in 2015. But before he died, he made some interesting deposits into offshore accounts, deposits that trace back to a holding company in the Cayman Islands." Betty gasped. "You found all that in 2 days?" Margaret smiled grimly. "I told you I know people." That night, the 3 of them drove to the Pemberton estate. Harold had been reluctant to return so soon, but Margaret insisted she needed to see the vault for herself. They entered through the same broken doorway, climbed down the same hidden stairs, and opened the same heavy oak door. Margaret stood in the entrance of the vault, flashlight in hand, and slowly turned in a circle. "My God," she whispered, "it's real. It's all real." "We told you," Betty said. "I know, but seeing it—" Margaret walked to the nearest shelf and lifted down one of the metal containers. She opened it and stared at the bundled cash inside. "This changes everything." She set down the container and turned to face her parents. "We have 3 options. 1. We report this to the authorities and hope they don't find some way to take it from us. 2. We keep it secret and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Or 3. 3, Harold prompted. Margaret's eyes were hard. 3. We find out who killed Marcus Pemberton. We expose them. And we use this fortune to do exactly what he wanted. Help people and burn down the system that protected his murderers for almost 40 years. Harold and Betty looked at each other. They didn't need to speak. After 53 years of marriage, some decisions were made in silence. Betty turned back to Margaret and smiled. "Option 3, Margaret nodded. "Then we have work to do." She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. After a moment, someone answered. "It's me," Margaret said. "I'm in Tennessee, and I need everything you can find on a fire that happened in Hawkins County in 1987. She paused. "Yes, I know it's old. That's the point. Someone buried this story a long time ago." She glanced at her parents, standing together in the dim light of the vault, surrounded by a fortune that should have changed the world decades ago. "And we're going to dig it up." The investigation began quietly, carefully, like threading a needle in the dark. Margaret worked from the small kitchen table in her parents' apartment, her laptop open, her phone constantly buzzing with calls from contacts she'd cultivated over 30 years of legal work. The private investigator, a man named Raymond Cole, arrived 3 days after Margaret. He was in his early 60s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see through walls. He'd spent 25 years with the FBI before retiring to do private work, and according to Margaret, he was the best in the business. "Show me everything," he said when they met at the mansion. Harold led him down the hidden stairs, through the heavy oak door, into the vault. Raymond walked the rows of shelves in silence, occasionally stopping to examine a container or flip through a stack of documents. When he reached Marcus Pemberton's journal, he read it cover to cover without speaking. Finally, he looked up at Harold and Betty. "You've stepped into something very old and very dangerous," he said. "Whoever killed Pemberton didn't just want his money. They wanted to make sure this vault was never found." "But they didn't find it themselves," Betty said. "The fire didn't reveal it." "No, and that's what saved them." Raymond set down the journal. "If they'd found this vault, they would have taken everything and disappeared. But since they didn't, they had to do the next best thing, make sure no one else ever found it either." "The buyers who kept having accidents," Harold said quietly. Raymond nodded. "I'll need to look into each one, but my guess is that whoever's behind this has been monitoring this property for almost 4 decades, watching, waiting, making sure anyone who got too close had a reason to leave." "And now we're here," Margaret said. "Yes," Raymond's expression was grim. "Which means, sooner or later, they'll come for you too." The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week later. Harold was at the mansion, clearing debris from what had once been the dining room, when he heard a car coming up the driveway. He set down his work gloves and walked to the entrance, expecting to see Margaret or Betty returning from their supply run. Instead, he saw a black Mercedes sedan gleaming and out of place against the overgrown grounds. It stopped at the base of the stone steps, and a man stepped out. He was younger than Harold by at least 30 years, with slicked-back silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Harold's car. He climbed the steps with the easy confidence of someone who owned everything he surveyed. "Mr. Simmons?" he called out. "Harold Simmons?" Harold didn't move from the doorway. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "My name is Victor Ashford. I'm an attorney representing certain parties with an interest in this property." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, holding it out like a peace offering. "Might we have a word?" Harold didn't take the card. "I don't know you, and I don't know your clients. This is private property." Of course. Ashford lowered the card but didn't seem discouraged. "I understand completely. You've made a significant investment here and you're protective of it. That's admirable." "What do you want?" Ashford's smile widened. "Straight to business. I appreciate that." He clasped his hands behind his back and looked up at the ruined mansion. "My clients have been interested in this property for many years. They've watched it pass from owner to owner, each one failing to see its potential. But you, Mr. Simmons, you seem different." Harold said nothing. "My clients would like to make you an offer," Ashford continued. "A generous offer. $500,000, cash, for the property and everything on it. You walk away with more money than you've ever seen in your life, and my clients take on the burden of this." He gestured at the charred walls. "Restoration project." Harold's jaw tightened. "Not interested." Ashford raised an eyebrow. "You haven't even heard the terms." "Don't need to. This property isn't for sale." "Mr. Simmons." Ashford's voice shifted, the smooth charm giving way to something harder. "I'm not sure you understand your position. This mansion has been nothing but trouble for everyone who's touched it. Accidents happen. Misfortunes occur. The smart move, the safe move, would be to take the money and enjoy your retirement." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." Ashford's smile was gone now. "Friendly advice from people who have been watching this property for a very long time. People who don't like surprises." Harold stepped forward, his old hands curling into fists at his sides. "Let me give you some advice in return. Get off my property, and tell your clients that if they want this land, they'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands." Ashford studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and adjusted his tie. "That can be arranged, Mr. Simmons." He turned and walked back to his car without another word. The Mercedes pulled away, disappearing down the driveway in a cloud of dust. Harold stood in the doorway, his heart pounding harder than it should. When Betty and Margaret returned an hour later, he told them everything. "Victor Ashford," Margaret muttered, typing the name into her laptop. "Let's see who we're dealing with." The search took less than 5 minutes. Ashford was a partner at a prestigious law firm in Nashville, one that specialized in real estate acquisitions and corporate restructuring. His client list was confidential, but Raymond's contacts were able to dig up some interesting connections. "The firm has represented 3 different buyers who attempted to purchase this property over the years," Raymond reported the next morning, "including Richard Crane, the developer who died in 1994. Betty frowned. "Wait, if they represented Crane, and Crane died after buying the property, then they've been involved from the beginning," Margaret finished. "They're not just representing interested parties. They are the interested parties." Harold sat heavily in his chair. "They've been circling this place for 40 years, waiting for someone to give up or die so they could sweep in and take it." "But they never found the vault," Betty said. "They killed Pemberton, burned his house, and still never found what they were looking for." "Which means they didn't know exactly where it was," Raymond added. "They knew Pemberton had hidden assets. Everyone in certain circles knew that, but they didn't know about the staircase, the hidden passage, the vault itself." Margaret looked at her parents. "Until now. Until you found it." "But we haven't told anyone," Harold protested. Raymond shook his head slowly. "You didn't have to. These people have been watching this property for decades. The moment you started clearing debris, the moment you started spending time here, they knew something had changed. They're not sure what you found, but they know you found something." "And now they're trying to buy us off before we can use it," Betty said. "Exactly." The threats escalated quickly after that. 2 days after Ashford's visit, Harold received a notice from the county inspector's office. The mansion had been flagged for multiple code violations. An inspection team would arrive within the week to assess the property. If violations were confirmed, the county could condemn the structure and force its demolition. "They're trying to destroy the evidence," Margaret said, reading the notice. "If they can't buy the property, they'll tear it down." "Can they do that?" Betty asked. "Legally, maybe. If the building is truly unsafe, they have grounds." Margaret set down the paper. "But the timing isn't coincidental. Someone pulled strings to make this happen." Harold reached for the phone. "I'll call a lawyer." "I am a lawyer," Margaret reminded him. "And I'm telling you, this is going to get worse before it gets better." She was right. The next day, Betty answered the phone to hear a voice she didn't recognize. Male, cold, distorted somehow, like it was being run through a machine. "Leave the property," the voice said. "Take your husband and your daughter and leave. This is your only warning." The line went dead before Betty could respond. She stood in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her hands shaking. When Harold found her 5 minutes later, she was sitting at the table, staring at nothing. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "They called." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They told us to leave." Harold's face went pale. Then it went red. Then something shifted in his eyes, something Betty hadn't seen in decades. The same look he'd had when a foreman at the factory tried to cheat him out of overtime pay. The same look he'd had when a doctor told him his son might not survive the car accident. The look of a man who had decided he would not be moved. "They can threaten all they want," he said quietly. "We're not going anywhere." But the stress was taking its toll. That night, as they prepared for bed in their cramped apartment, Harold felt a tightness in his chest. He tried to ignore it, tried to breathe through it, but the pressure only grew. "Harold!" Betty's voice seemed far away. "Harold, you're sweating. What's wrong?" "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was weak. "Just need to sit down." He didn't make it to the chair. His knees buckled, and suddenly Betty was screaming his name, and the world was spinning, and all he could think was, "Not now. Not when we're so close." The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. The paramedics worked quickly, efficiently, hooking Harold up to monitors and asking questions he couldn't quite process. Betty rode beside him, holding his hand, her face streaked with tears. "You're going to be fine," she kept saying. "You have to be fine. We have too much to do." At the hospital, the doctors ran tests, an EKG, blood work, imaging. Hours passed in a blur of beeping machines and hushed conversations. Finally, a young doctor with tired eyes came to speak with them. "It wasn't a heart attack," she said. "It was a stress-induced episode. Your heart went into an irregular rhythm because of elevated cortisol and adrenaline. Basically, Mr. Simmons, your body is telling you to slow down." Harold shook his head. "I can't slow down, not now." The doctor exchanged a look with Betty. "I understand you're dealing with something important, but if you don't manage your stress, the next episode could be much worse." She paused. "You need rest, you need support, and you need to let other people carry some of the weight." They kept him overnight for observation. Betty stayed in the chair beside his bed, refusing to leave even when the nurses offered her a cot in the waiting room. In the quiet hours of the early morning, Harold reached for her hand. "Maybe they're right," he said softly. "Maybe we're too old for this. Maybe we should just take the money and walk away." Betty was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned close and kissed his forehead. "Harold Simmons, you listen to me. We have spent our entire lives walking away from things, walking away from dreams because they were too big, walking away from fights because they were too hard, walking away from our own daughter because we were too proud to admit we needed help." She sat back and looked him in the eyes. "I am done walking away, and I know you are too." Harold felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "What if I'm not strong enough? Then we'll be strong together." That's what we've always done." Margaret arrived at the hospital the next morning, her face drawn with worry. She'd been coordinating with Raymond, managing the legal response to the county inspection, trying to keep 100 plates spinning at once. But when she saw her father in that hospital bed, everything else fell away. "Daddy," she whispered, a word she hadn't used since she was 12 years old. Harold opened his arms and she fell into them, sobbing against his chest like a child. "I'm sorry," she said between tears. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I let us drift apart. I'm sorry." "Hush," Harold said, stroking her hair. "None of that matters now. You're here. That's all that matters." Betty joined them, and for a long moment the three of them held each other in that sterile hospital room, healing wounds that had nothing to do with hearts or arteries. When they finally separated, Margaret wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "We need to talk about what happens next." "The inspection is in 3 days," Harold said. "I know, and Raymond has been doing some digging." Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her notes. "The inspector assigned to our case is a man named Dale Whitmore. He's been with the county for 22 years. Clean record, by all accounts a decent man. So what's the problem?" "His son." Margaret looked up. "His son works for Ashford's law firm. Started there 6 months ago, right after law school." Betty's face fell. "They've compromised him." "Maybe, maybe not. But it's too much of a coincidence to ignore." Margaret put away her phone. "We need to get ahead of this. We need to control the narrative before they can spin it against us." "How?" Harold asked. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said something that would change everything. "We need to go public." The journalist's name was Sarah Chen. She was 28 years old, a reporter for a regional newspaper that had been slowly dying for the past decade. She covered local politics, community events, and the occasional human interest story. She had never broken a major story in her life. When she received the call from Margaret Simmons, she almost didn't answer. "Miss Chen, my name is Margaret Simmons. I'm a lawyer from California, and I'm calling on behalf of my parents, who recently purchased the Pemberton estate in Hawkins County." Sarah frowned. "The burned mansion? The one everyone says is cursed?" "That's the one. My parents found something there. Something that powerful people have been trying to hide for almost 40 years. And we need someone to tell the story before those people can silence us." Sarah had heard pitches like this before. Conspiracy theories usually. Someone convinced the government was hiding aliens, or the water supply was poisoned. She had learned to be skeptical. "What exactly did they find?" "Come to the property tomorrow morning," Margaret said. "See for yourself. If you think it's worth a story, we'll give you exclusive access. If not, you've lost nothing but a few hours." Sarah almost said no. She had deadlines, responsibilities, a dozen stories already in progress. But something in Margaret's voice made her pause. Something that sounded less like desperation and more like conviction. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock." Sarah arrived at the Pemberton estate expecting to find 2 confused elderly people who had convinced themselves their crumbling mansion held some kind of secret. What she found instead defied everything she thought she knew about the world. Harold and Betty met her at the entrance, looking older and more tired than she'd expected. Margaret stood behind them, professional and composed. And beside Margaret was a man Sarah didn't recognize. Someone with watchful eyes and a bearing that suggested military or law enforcement. "Thank you for coming," Betty said warmly. "Would you like some coffee before we begin?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, clutching her notebook. "You said you found something. What exactly are we talking about?" Harold and Betty exchanged a look. Then Harold nodded toward the entrance. "It's easier to show you." They led her through the ruined mansion, past collapsed ceilings and charred walls, to the grand marble staircase that rose from the entrance hall. Sarah watched, confused, as Harold knelt down and pressed something along the edge of the third step. Click. The marble shifted. Sarah's confusion turned to shock as she watched Harold lift the step to reveal a hidden passage. She followed them down, her heart pounding, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. And then she stepped into the vault. "Oh my God," she breathed. She walked the rows of shelves in a daze, touching the containers, opening one to see the bundled cash inside. She examined the gold bars, the stock certificates, the wooden crates full of gems. She read Marcus Pemberton's journal from beginning to end, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. "This is real," she whispered. "It's real," Margaret confirmed. "And there are people who will do anything to keep it secret." Sarah sat down on a wooden crate, her mind reeling. How much is all this worth? "Our conservative estimate is $260 million. Sarah laughed, a high-pitched sound that bordered on hysteria. $260 million, hidden under a staircase, for almost 40 years. "And the man who hid it was murdered for it," Raymond added. "Murdered by people who never found what they were looking for. People who have been protecting this secret ever since." Sarah looked at him sharply. "Murdered? The fire was ruled an accident. The fire was arson, and we can prove it." Raymond handed her a folder. Fire marshal's report, bank records showing payoffs, interviews with witnesses who were pressured to stay silent. "Everything you need." Sarah took the folder with trembling hands. She flipped through the documents, her reporter's instincts kicking in despite her shock. Dates, names, account numbers. It was all there, meticulously documented. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why not take this to a major network, the New York Times, someone with resources?" Betty stepped forward and took Sarah's hand. "Because you're local," she said gently. "Because you know these people, this community. Because when the powerful try to dismiss this as conspiracy theory or fraud, you'll be able to show them that it's real, that it happened here, in their backyards, while they looked the other way." Sarah stared at her for a long moment. Then she looked around the vault one more time, at the fortune that had been waiting in darkness for 4 decades. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tell me everything." The story took 2 weeks to write. Sarah interviewed Harold and Betty for hours, recording their memories, their fears, their hopes for what this discovery might mean. She talked to Raymond, who walked her through the investigation step by step. She drove to Nashville and confronted Victor Ashford outside his law firm, recording his terse refusal to comment. She tracked down the descendants of the fire marshal Thomas Whitfield and discovered that his family had been living well beyond their means for generations. And she dug into the Pemberton fire itself. The official investigation had been cursory at best. 3 ignition points dismissed as faulty wiring. No autopsy performed on Marcus Pemberton's body. No follow-up on the mysterious circumstances surrounding his daughter Eleanor's visit. But Sarah found witnesses. An elderly woman who had been a maid at the estate remembered seeing unfamiliar cars on the property the night before the fire. A retired firefighter recalled being told to stand down when he questioned the investigation's conclusions. A former county clerk produced documents showing that key evidence had been destroyed just months after the fire. Piece by piece, Sarah assembled a picture of corruption so vast, so entrenched, that it seemed impossible. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The night before the story was set to publish, Sarah sat in her cramped apartment, staring at her laptop screen. The article was finished. 12,000 words documenting 40 years of lies, cover-ups, and murder. Her phone rang. "Unknown number," she answered. "Ms. Chen." The voice was male, cold, familiar in its distortion. "You have one chance to kill this story. Take it and you'll be rewarded. Ignore it and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Sarah's heart pounded. But she thought of Harold and Betty, 2 elderly people who had risked everything to do the right thing. She thought of Marcus Pemberton, murdered in his own home because he dared to dream of helping others. "The story runs tomorrow," she said. "Then you've made your choice." The line went dead. Sarah sat in the darkness for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her editor. "Run it," she said. "Front page, tomorrow morning." The story hit like a bomb. Sarah's article was picked up by regional outlets within hours, then national ones by the end of the day. Television crews descended on Hawkins County. Reporters camped outside the Pemberton estate. The story of two elderly people who had bought a burned mansion for $12,000 and found $260 million hidden beneath the staircase captured the nation's imagination. But it was the darker revelations that truly shocked people: the arson, the cover-up, the decades of intimidation and violence designed to protect a terrible secret. Within a week, the state attorney general announced an investigation. Within 2 weeks, federal prosecutors got involved. The FBI opened a cold case file on the Pemberton fire, treating it as a potential homicide for the first time in almost 40 years, and then the arrests began. Victor Ashford was the first. Federal agents arrived at his Nashville law firm with a warrant and took him into custody in front of his horrified colleagues. He was charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. But he wasn't the last. The investigation spread outward like ripples in a pond. County officials who had looked the other way. Businessmen who had profited from the cover-up. Descendants of the original conspirators who had inherited both wealth and silence. 2 elderly men, both in their 80s, were eventually indicted for Marcus Pemberton's murder. They had been young men in 1987, hired hands who had set the fire and watched the mansion burn. They had lived quiet lives ever since, protected by the same powerful interests that had paid them. Justice, finally, after almost 40 years. Harold watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, where he was being monitored after a second, milder cardiac episode. Betty sat beside him, holding his hand. Margaret stood by the window, phone constantly buzzing with updates from Raymond and Sarah and a dozen other people now involved in the case. "They're talking about us on CNN," Betty said softly, nodding toward the television. Harold smiled weakly. "Never thought I'd be famous." "You're not famous," Betty corrected. "You're brave. There's a difference." Margaret turned from the window. "The legal team thinks we have a clear case for ownership. Pemberton had no living heirs and the property was legally sold. Everything in the vault technically belongs to you." $260 million, Harold murmured. "Still doesn't feel real." "It's real, Daddy." Margaret sat on the edge of his bed. "And soon you're going to have to decide what to do with it." Harold looked at Betty. They had talked about this late at night when sleep wouldn't come, in whispered conversations that felt like prayers. "We already know what we're going to do," he said. Betty squeezed his hand. "We're going to honor Marcus Pemberton's wishes. We're going to do what he always wanted to do, but never got the chance." Margaret's eyes glistened. "And what's that?" Harold smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in weeks. "We're going to help people, every single one we can." The legal proceedings took longer than anyone expected. 3 months of depositions, hearings, and endless paperwork. Lawyers argued about property rights, estate law, and the proper handling of assets that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. The state of Tennessee claimed an interest. The federal government raised questions about tax implications. Even distant relatives of Marcus Pemberton, people who had never known the man existed until they saw his name on the news, came forward with claims that their attorneys assured them were legitimate. Harold watched it all from a distance, recovering from his cardiac episode in the small cottage they'd rented near the estate. The doctors had been clear: no stress, no exertion, no involvement in anything that might elevate his heart rate. Betty enforced these instructions with an iron will, confiscating his phone when the news coverage became too intense and redirecting visitors who wanted to ask questions about the case. "Your father needs rest," she would say firmly. "Whatever it is can wait." Margaret handled everything else. She had taken an indefinite leave from her firm in California, moving into the cottage's spare bedroom and transforming the kitchen table into a command center of legal documents and strategy notes. She worked 18-hour days, coordinating with the team of lawyers she'd assembled, managing media requests, and navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy that surrounded the case. Raymond Cole remained involved as well, his investigation expanding as new evidence came to light. The deeper he dug, the more connections he found. The conspiracy to hide Marcus Pemberton's fortune had touched dozens of lives over nearly 40 years, corrupting officials, silencing witnesses, and leaving a trail of suspicious accidents and unexplained misfortunes. "This is bigger than anyone realized," Raymond told Margaret one evening, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "The original conspirators are dead or in custody, but their network extended into every level of local government. They had people in the sheriff's department, the county clerk's office, the tax assessor's office. Anyone who might have stumbled onto the truth was either bought off or pushed out." Margaret studied the documents with tired eyes. How did they keep it secret for so long? Fear, mostly, and compartmentalization. Raymond pointed to a diagram he'd drawn. No single person knew the whole picture. The fire marshal knew there was a cover-up, but didn't know why. The lawyers knew there were assets to protect, but didn't know where they were hidden. Everyone had just enough information to do their job and not enough to become a threat. "Until my parents bought the property." Exactly. Your parents were an anomaly. They weren't connected to anyone. They weren't looking for anything. They just wanted a home. Raymond shook his head slowly. The conspirators had no way to predict them, no way to control them, and by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The breakthrough came in late spring, 5 months after Harold and Betty had first descended into the vault. A federal judge ruled that, under Tennessee property law, the contents of the vault legally belonged to whoever owned the property at the time of discovery. Since Harold and Betty had purchased the estate through a legitimate county auction, and since no valid claims had been filed against the property in the intervening decades, the fortune was theirs. The ruling was appealed, of course. Lawyers for the state argued that assets of this magnitude should be subject to special consideration. Attorneys for the distant Pemberton relatives claimed that Marcus had never intended to abandon his fortune, that it should pass to his heirs regardless of where it had been found. But the appeals court upheld the original decision, and when the case reached the Tennessee Supreme Court 6 months later, the justices declined to hear it. The fortune was theirs, legally, officially, irrevocably. Margaret delivered the news to her parents on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after they had first bid on the Pemberton estate at the county auction. "It's over," she said, setting down her phone. "The Supreme Court refused the appeal. There's no one left to challenge us." Betty sat down slowly, her hand pressed to her chest. "It's really ours. It's really yours." Margaret smiled through tears. $260 million, free and clear. Harold stood at the window looking out at the estate. The mansion was still a ruin, still blackened and broken, but somehow it looked different now. Not haunted, not cursed, just waiting. "Then it's time," he said quietly. Betty rose and joined him at the window. "Time for what?" Harold turned to face his wife and daughter. His eyes were clear, his voice steady. "Time to keep our promise." The Pemberton Simmons Foundation was established on the first anniversary of the discovery. Harold and Betty signed the incorporation papers in a small ceremony at the restored servants' quarters of the estate, surrounded by Margaret, Raymond, Sarah Chen, and a handful of others who had helped them survive the past year. The Foundation's mission statement was simple: to honor the legacy of Marcus James Pemberton by using his hidden fortune to help those in need. scholarships for students who couldn't afford college, grants for families facing medical emergencies, support for small businesses struggling to survive, and at the center of it all, a plan to transform the burned mansion into something new. "We're not going to rebuild it as a private home," Harold announced at the press conference that followed the ceremony. "This place has been hidden in darkness for too long. It's time to bring it into the light." The restoration took 18 months. Architects worked alongside historians to preserve what could be saved while reimagining what had been lost. The grand entrance hall was rebuilt with the same marble and moulding that had defined it in 1926. The collapsed east wing was transformed into a modern community centre with meeting rooms, a library, and a technology lab. The old ballroom became an event space where weddings, graduations, and community celebrations could be held, and the vault, that vast underground chamber where Marcus Pemberton had hidden his fortune, was converted into a museum. The Pemberton Legacy Museum opened to the public on a warm spring day, 2.5 years after Harold and Betty had first descended those hidden stairs. Visitors could walk the same path they had walked, see the shelves where the containers had been stored, read Marcus Pemberton's journal displayed in a climate-controlled case. But the museum wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. One wing was dedicated to the stories of people the foundation had helped. Photographs and testimonials from scholarship recipients who had graduated from college. Letters from families who had avoided bankruptcy thanks to emergency grants. Profiles of small business owners who had turned foundation loans into thriving enterprises. "This is what it was all for," Betty said softly, walking through the gallery on opening day. "This is what Marcus wanted." Harold stood beside her, leaning on the cane he'd needed since his second cardiac episode. His health had never fully recovered from the stress of the past 2 years. The doctors said he might have 5 years left, maybe 10 if he was lucky. But standing here, surrounded by evidence of lives changed and futures secured, he felt more alive than he had in decades. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." Betty took his hand. "We did it together." The free clinic opened 6 months later, built in the renovated west wing of the mansion. It was staffed by doctors and nurses who had volunteered their time, supported by foundation grants that covered equipment, supplies, and operating costs. Anyone could walk in, regardless of ability to pay. No one was turned away. The first patient was a young mother named Jessica, who had been putting off treatment for a persistent cough because she couldn't afford the copay at her regular doctor. The clinic diagnosed her with early-stage pneumonia and provided antibiotics at no cost. "I don't understand," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" The nurse who treated her, a woman named Patricia, who had retired from a hospital in Knoxville to volunteer at the clinic, smiled gently. "Because someone believed that helping people shouldn't depend on how much money they have," she said, "and because 2 people who had nothing decided to share everything." Jessica looked around the clinic, at the gleaming equipment and the warm waiting room and the photographs on the walls showing the mansion's transformation. "Who were they?" she asked. "The people who started all this?" Patricia pointed to a framed photograph near the entrance. It showed an elderly couple standing on the steps of the restored mansion, holding hands and smiling at the camera. "Harold and Betty Simmons," Patricia said. "They bought this place for $12,000 and found a fortune hidden under the stairs, and instead of keeping it for themselves, they gave it all away." Jessica stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then she wiped her eyes and whispered, "Angels. They must be angels." The scholarship program grew faster than anyone anticipated. In its first year, the foundation awarded grants to 47 students from Hawkins County and the surrounding areas. By the 3rd year, that number had grown to over 200. By the 5th year, the program had expanded to include students from across Tennessee, with plans to go national. Each scholarship came with more than just money. Recipients were paired with mentors, given access to internship opportunities, and invited to annual gatherings at the mansion where they could meet other scholars and share their experiences. Harold insisted on attending every gathering, even as his health continued to decline. He would sit in a wheelchair near the entrance of the restored ballroom, shaking hands with each student, asking about their studies, their dreams, their families. "Education is the key," he would say, his voice weaker now, but still steady. "My father never got past 8th grade. I barely finished high school. But you can go anywhere. Do anything. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The students would nod, some of them crying, all of them changed by the encounter with this frail old man who had given them a chance they never expected to have. One student, a young woman named Maria who was studying to become a doctor, asked Harold a question that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "Mr. Simmons, why did you do it? You could have kept the money. You could have lived like a king. Why give it all away?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Maria's hand. "Because I've been poor my whole life," he said. "And being poor taught me something that being rich never could. It taught me that the things that matter most, love, family, purpose, those things can't be bought. They can only be given." He squeezed her hand gently. Marcus Pemberton spent 40 years hiding his fortune because he was afraid. Afraid of losing it. Afraid of trusting anyone. And in the end, that fear killed him. Harold's eyes glistened. "I didn't want to die the same way. I didn't want to spend whatever time I have left being afraid. So I gave it away, all of it. And you know what?" Maria shook her head. "I've never been richer in my life." The family that had once been fractured slowly became whole again. Margaret sold her house in California and moved permanently to Tennessee, taking over management of the foundation as Harold's health declined. She bought a small farm just down the road from the estate, close enough to visit her parents every day. "I spent 30 years chasing success," she told Betty one evening as they sat on the porch of the cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I thought if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, I could prove that I didn't need anyone." Betty reached over and took her daughter's hand. "And now? Now I know that needing people isn't weakness. It's what makes us human." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "I wasted so much time, Mum. So many years I could have spent with you and Dad." "You're here now," Betty said gently. "That's what matters." Margaret's children, Harold and Betty's grandchildren, began visiting regularly as well. James, the eldest at 28, had inherited his grandfather's mechanical aptitude and spent his visits helping with maintenance around the estate. Sarah, 25, was a social worker who eventually joined the foundation's staff, helping to evaluate grant applications and connect recipients with resources. And Michael, just 22, was still in college, studying non-profit management with plans to eventually take over the foundation's operations. 3 generations, Harold said one Sunday afternoon, watching his grandchildren play cornhole on the lawn while Margaret and Betty prepared lunch in the cottage kitchen. 3 generations working together. That's something money can't buy. Raymond Cole stopped by occasionally, though his investigation had long since concluded. The last of the conspirators had been convicted, the final loose ends tied up. But he and Harold had developed an unlikely friendship, 2 old men who had seen too much of the world's darkness and found unexpected light in each other's company. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Raymond said during one of his visits, nursing a cup of coffee on the cottage porch. "That key, the one you found in the alcove beside the vault door." Harold nodded slowly. "What about it?" "Pemberton left it there deliberately. He could have hidden it anywhere, could have made it almost impossible to find. But he put it right there, right where anyone who found the passage would see it." Raymond shook his head. He wanted someone to find the vault. He wanted someone to finish what he started. But why didn't he just give it away himself? Why hide it all and hope someone would come along? Raymond was quiet for a moment. Fear, probably. The same fear that made him hide the fortune in the first place. He spent so many years protecting it that he couldn't imagine letting it go. He looked at Harold. But you could. You and Betty, you were able to do what he couldn't. That's not nothing, Harold. That's everything. Harold stared out at the mansion in the distance, its restored facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. I used to think courage was about doing big things, he said quietly. Fighting in wars, running into burning buildings, saving lives. He paused. But I've learned it's really about the small things, saying yes when you're scared, trusting people when you've been hurt, giving away what you have because someone else needs it more. He turned to Raymond with a faint smile. Betty taught me that. 55 years of marriage, and she's still teaching me things. The 5th anniversary of the Foundation's establishment was marked with a ceremony unlike any the region had ever seen. Over 1,000 people gathered on the grounds of the Pemberton estate. Scholarship recipients, clinic patients, Foundation staff, community members, journalists, and dignitaries from across the state. A stage had been erected in front of the mansion's restored entrance, draped in banners bearing the Foundation's logo, a staircase ascending toward a rising sun. Speakers shared stories of how the Foundation had changed their lives. A choir from the local high school performed a medley of songs about hope and perseverance, and at the center of it all, seated in places of honor, were Harold and Betty Simmons. Harold was 83 now, frail and thin, dependent on oxygen and a wheelchair. The doctors had given him 6 months, maybe less, but his eyes were bright, his mind sharp, his spirit undiminished. Betty sat beside him, her hand never leaving his. At 81, she was healthier than her husband, but aged by the worry and care of the past 5 years. Her hair was pure white now, her face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. Margaret stood at the podium, preparing to introduce her parents for what everyone knew might be the last time. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. 2 people who had nothing made a decision that changed everything. They could have taken the easy path. They could have kept what they found and lived out their days in comfort. But that's not who they are. She turned to look at Harold and Betty. My parents taught me that wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the lives you touch, the people you help, the legacy you leave behind. And by that measure, they are the richest people I have ever known. The crowd applauded, many of them wiping tears from their eyes. Margaret stepped aside, and Harold was wheeled to the microphone. Betty walked beside him, adjusting his oxygen tube, making sure he was comfortable. Harold looked out at the sea of faces before him. Scholarship students he had met over the years, patients from the clinic, children and grandchildren of people the Foundation had helped. A community transformed by one decision, one moment of courage, one choice to give instead of take. He cleared his throat, his voice thin but clear. When I was a young man, he began, I worked in a factory, same job for 41 years, same machine, same tasks, same paycheck every 2 weeks. I used to think that was what life was about, working hard, paying your bills, not asking for too much. He paused, gathering his strength. Then Betty and I bought this place. We were just looking for somewhere to live out our final years, somewhere with a garden and a porch swing. We didn't expect to find anything except maybe some peace and quiet. A soft laugh rippled through the crowd. But life has a way of surprising you. And what we found under that staircase, it wasn't just money. It was a second chance, a chance to do something that mattered, a chance to help people we'd never met and might never meet, a chance to turn 40 years of hidden fear into a future of open hope. Harold's eyes glistened, but his voice remained steady. Marcus Pemberton spent his life being afraid of losing what he had, afraid of trusting anyone with his secret, and in the end, that fear consumed him. But his dream, his vision of using his fortune to help others, that dream didn't die with him. It just waited for someone to find it, waited for someone to believe in it, waited for someone to make it real. He reached over and took Betty's hand. "I'm not going to be here much longer. The doctors have been pretty clear about that, but I'm not afraid, because I know that what we started here will continue. The scholarships will keep going. The clinic will keep serving, the foundation will keep growing, and somewhere out there right now, there's a young person whose life is going to be changed because two old people decided to take a chance." He looked out at the crowd one last time. That's the real treasure. Not the money, not the gold, not the gems. The real treasure is knowing that your life mattered, that you made a difference, that when you're gone, the world will be a little bit better than it was when you arrived. He smiled, the same smile Betty had fallen in love with at a church picnic 55 years ago. "Thank you all for being part of our story, and thank you for letting us be part of yours." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. People stood, many of them crying openly, clapping until their hands were sore. Harold sat back in his wheelchair, exhausted but content. Betty leaned down and kissed his forehead. "You did it," she whispered. "You said everything perfectly." "We did it," he corrected. "We always did everything together." That night, after the crowds had gone and the grounds had fallen quiet, Harold and Betty sat together on the porch of their small cottage, looking out at the mansion they had saved. The stars were brilliant overhead, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Do you remember the first time we saw this place?" Betty asked softly. Harold nodded. "You said you could see what it used to be, what it could be again." "And look at it now," Betty's voice caught. "Look at what we built." Harold squeezed her hand. "Not what we built, what we gave." They sat in comfortable silence for a long while, two old souls at the end of their journey, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived. "I'm not afraid anymore," Harold said finally. "I thought I would be at the end, but I'm not." Betty turned to look at him. "Neither am I." "Do you think Marcus Pemberton ever found peace, wherever he is?" Betty considered the question. "I think he did. I think when we opened that vault, when we decided to use his fortune the way he always wanted, something changed. Not just for us, for him too." Harold smiled. "Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not what you leave behind, but what you set free." Betty rested her head on his shoulder, the same way she had done for 55 years, the same way she would continue to do for whatever time they had left. "I love you, Harold Simmons." "I love you too, Betty, more than all the treasure in the world." The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to a love story that had begun at a church picnic and ended with a fortune that changed thousands of lives. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Pemberton estate, everything would continue. The scholarships, the clinic, the foundation, the mission. But for now, in this quiet moment, there was only the two of them. An elderly couple who had bet everything on a burned-down mansion and discovered something far more valuable than money. They had discovered that the greatest fortune isn't what you keep, it's what you give away. Harold Simmons passed away 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep, with Betty holding his hand. He was 83 years old. He had lived long enough to see the Foundation's 5th anniversary, long enough to know that his legacy was secure, long enough to say goodbye to everyone he loved. The funeral was held at the Pemberton estate in the restored ballroom where so many scholarship recipients had gathered. Over 2,000 people attended, spilling out onto the grounds, filling the gardens and pathways with mourners who had come to pay their respects. Margaret delivered the eulogy, her voice breaking only once. "My father spent 41 years working at a factory," she said. "He never made more than $40,000 a year. He never took a vacation longer than a week. He never bought anything he didn't need or asked for anything he hadn't earned. She paused, looking out at the crowd. And yet, in the last 5 years of his life, he gave away more than $250 million. He funded scholarships for over 1,000 students. He built a clinic that has treated more than 15,000 patients. He created a foundation that will continue helping people for generations to come. Margaret wiped her eyes. When people ask me what my father's legacy is, I don't talk about the money. I talk about the way he made people feel, the way he shook every student's hand and asked about their dreams, the way he sat with patients at the clinic and listened to their stories, the way he loved my mother every single day for 55 years. She looked at Betty, seated in the front row, surrounded by family. That's the real inheritance, not the fortune, the love. Betty survived her husband by 4 years. She continued to live in the cottage on the estate grounds, visited daily by Margaret and the grandchildren, surrounded by the community that had grown up around the foundation. She spent her final years exactly as she had always wanted, tending her garden, sitting on the porch swing Harold had finally built for her, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors she had never tired of seeing. On her last day, she asked to be taken to the mansion. Margaret wheeled her through the restored entrance hall, past the grand marble staircase, into the museum that had once been a hidden vault. Betty sat for a long time in front of the display case that held Marcus Pemberton's journal. She reached out and touched the glass gently, as if she could feel the words beneath her fingers. "We did it, Marcus," she whispered. "We kept our promise." She closed her eyes and smiled. "And now I'm going to see Harold again." She passed away that night peacefully with her family around her. She was 85 years old. She had lived long enough to see the Foundation's 10th anniversary, long enough to know that the dream she and Harold had shared would continue forever. The Pemberton Simmons Foundation continues to this day. It has awarded scholarships to over 5,000 students. The clinic has treated more than 50,000 patients. The community center hosts hundreds of events each year, and the museum welcomes visitors from around the world, all of them eager to hear the story of 2 elderly people who bought a burned mansion for $12,000 and found something far more valuable than money. On the wall of the museum near the entrance hangs a simple plaque. It bears no elaborate decoration, no gilded frame, just plain words on polished wood. In memory of Harold and Betty Simmons, who taught us that the greatest treasure isn't what you keep, it's what you give away. Below the plaque, in a small glass case, rests the key that Harold found in the alcove beside the vault door. The heavy iron key with the bow shaped like a lion's head. The key that unlocked not just a door, but a destiny. Visitors often pause in front of that case, studying the key, wondering what it must have felt like to hold it for the first time, to know that everything was about to change, to face a choice between fear and faith, between keeping and giving, between the life you have and the life you could have. And perhaps in that moment of reflection, they hear a whisper, a voice from the past, speaking across the years. Some discoveries aren't about what you gain, they're about what you give away. Because in the end, that's what Harold and Betty Simmons taught the world. Not through speeches or ceremonies or grand gestures, but through the simple act of choosing love over fear, generosity over greed, legacy over luxury. They were just 2 ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice. And that choice rippled outward, touching lives they never knew, changing futures they would never see. Anyone can be rich if they're willing to measure wealth in the lives they change instead of the dollars they collect. As the final rays of sunlight faded over the Pemberton estate on that anniversary evening, a young girl stood before the memorial plaque, reading the words for the first time. She was 12 years old, the daughter of a former scholarship recipient, visiting the museum with her mother. "Mom," she asked quietly, "do you think I could ever do something like this? Help people the way they did?" Her mother knelt down beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart, you already can. Every act of kindness, every moment of generosity, every time you choose to help instead of ignore, you're carrying on their legacy. The girl looked back at the plaque, at the key in its glass case, at the photographs of Harold and Betty smiling on the steps of the mansion they had saved. "Then that's what I'm going to do," she said firmly. "I'm going to help people, just like them." Her mother smiled through tears. "And that," she said softly, "is exactly what they would have wanted." Because for Harold and Betty Simmons, and for everyone whose life they touched, this was never about the money. It was about the moment when two people who had nothing decided they had everything to give. And in that moment, they became immortal. Not because their names were carved in stone or printed in history books, but because their love, their courage, their faith in human goodness would echo through generations yet to come. Some stories end. This one never will. It just keeps being written, one act of kindness at a time, by everyone who remembers what two ordinary people proved. That the real treasure was never hidden under a staircase. It was hidden in their hearts all along. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances are waiting for you on screen. Click to keep watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest fortunes come to those who are brave enough to give everything away.